So my name is Charlie Wilson, and I'm presenting this work with colleagues Barnaby Andrews and Emily Vrain, and we are all based at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in the UK. And our research is interested in the effect of social influence on the adoption of a range of digital consumer innovations which can help potentially address climate change. So the kinds of innovations we're interested in are shown here. So these blue app icons represent 7 transport-related innovations, each of which is an alternative to the mainstream way in which we get around, which is driving our own cars. So you see car clubs, peer-to-peer car sharing, ride sharing, shared ride hailing or Uber Pool, for those of you familiar with that, mobility as a service, which treats all sorts of transport options on a subscription service basis, and then electric vehicles and electric bikes. In the food domain, we're interested in 3 innovations: digital food hubs, or also known as online farmers markets, meal kits, which help reduce food waste, and 11th hour apps, which similarly help reduce food waste by connecting consumers to supermarkets and cafes and so on with surplus food. We looked at 3 homes innovations, all smart technologies which help us manage energy more effectively and efficiently in the home. And then finally, 3 energy related innovations, which are to do with how we can potentially generate, store and trade electricity from our own homes. So the details of these specific innovations are not so important, but it is important to recognize that each of them are relatively new. They are available to consumers or becoming available. They are digital in that they rely often on digital infrastructure or smartphone apps as interfaces, for example. They're all potentially low carbon, so if adopted at scale, they can help reduce emissions. And they are disruptive in that they represent a challenge, if you like, to mainstream consumption practices in each of these 4 domains. So our kind of overarching interest is in the role that social influence plays in the adoption of these consumer innovations. And the analytical framework that we use is diffusion of innovations from Rogers. And I'm sure this is quite familiar to many in this context, but the central insight of Rogers was that if you have a heterogeneous market or a heterogeneous group of potential adopters with varying risk preferences, the risk-seeking or the risk-tolerant early adopters will go first, try out, test, and start using innovations, and then communicate the benefits of them through their social networks to the more risk-averse later adopters. In other words, diffusion is fundamentally a process of social communication. Rogers specifically points to 4, if you like, overarching blocks of variables to consider when looking at adoption. So the social influence and social networks type variables you see on the right will be very familiar to those in this conference. Rogers also emphasized innovation attributes and adopter characteristics. So to take some examples, in terms of social influence mechanisms or information flows, we are interested in the ways people, this is both adopters, communicate information and also non-adopters receive information. And in terms of social networks, we're interested in the basic characteristics of potential adopters' social networks, the extent to which they receive information from homophilous others, and so on. With respect to innovation attributes, Rogers emphasizes 5 that are particularly influential on adoption rates, the main one being relative advantage, that is how much an advantage adopting the innovation is over your current practice, but also whether innovations are compatible with your existing life, they're easy to use, whether you can observe people using them or try them out before using them yourself, again, helping to reduce perceived risk. And finally, certain adopter characteristics will also help explain adoption. Given that many of the innovations we're looking at are low carbon, we're interested to see whether environmental values help explain adoption. And given that the innovations we're looking at are quite technological or digital, they've got kind of digital characteristics, we're interested in things like digital skills. And this is all controlling for sociodemographic and contextual variation. Okay, so what we did is we took our 17 innovations, which you see on the left, and we implemented a data collection exercise in the UK. This was in the autumn of 2019. We surveyed about 3,000 people, and we used a survey design which identified around 100 adopters of each innovation and around 100 non-adopters. And we deliberately screened out those people who had never heard of the innovations that we were talking about. So we were trying to capture some of the heterogeneity in the potential market for these innovations. So the first research question we asked was, does social influence help increase the propensity of non-adopters to adopt? So does social influence help get non-adopters comfortable with the risks and uncertainties that a new thing represents? So on the left, you see the survey data we used. In this case, we looked at the information seeking and information sources questions from our survey, and we compared two groups. We compared those non-adopters who said they had a high propensity to adopt one or more of the innovations, and we compared those with non-adopters who said they had a low propensity to adopt. And we reasoned that the high propensity non-adopters would essentially state that they had been more actively seeking information, that they had received more information from interpersonal sources, and that they'd also received more information from other sources. And this is exactly what we found. And in line with Rogers's expectations, we found that interpersonal sources show the largest effect. So this is cross-sectional survey data. We cannot infer causality, but it's consistent with the interpretation that interpersonal information flowing through interpersonal networks helps reduce non-adopters' perceived risks and uncertainties, and therefore makes them more likely to adopt innovations. We also looked at different social influence mechanisms. So we compared word of mouth, e-word of mouth, essentially social media usage, chat forums and so on, neighborhood effects, peer effects, and also social norms. And again, we found that all four of these social influence mechanisms was more influential on the high propensity non-adopters than the low propensity non-adopters. So again, we can't infer causality, but this is consistent with the idea that more information flowing through interpersonal mechanisms results in a higher propensity to adopt. And interestingly, it was e-word of mouth which showed the largest effect, which we sort of draw a tentative link between this and the fact that all our innovations were fundamentally digital in character. So overall, we conclude that yes, social influence mechanisms do seem to be important, particularly e-word of mouth, but we need to control for all the other stuff that might be going on. And so this is what we did in our second research question. We went back to our survey and we used data from all of these variables that are shown here, representing the four main blocks of variable, if you like, that Rogers says is important for adoption. So what we did is we took on the left, you see the survey data, so these four blocks of variables that we used from our survey, and we focused here rather than on the full set of 16 innovations, we focused on 7 transport innovations. And rather than comparing different groups of non-adopters, here we tried to predict adoption relative to non-adoption. So we used logistic models using blocks of variables, and the outcome variable in these models was adoption, yes or no. So I'm going to show you some initial results. These we've been working on these last week, so these are very much work in progress, but I think there are some interesting findings coming out nonetheless. So you'll see along the top the 7 transport innovations which we were looking at, and you'll see down the columns the blocks of variables which we tested. So adopter characteristics, innovation attributes, information flows or social influence, social network structure, and as I mentioned, we controlled for a range of contextual factors and socio-demographic factors. So the first thing to say is that if you look at the bottom, you'll see the model fits for each of these innovations, and you see that in a couple of cases they were pretty poor. This is due to some low sample sizes and also some quite noisy data due to definitional problems with these innovations. So treat those particular 2 models for shared ride hailing and for mobility as a service with a big pinch of salt. But the other 5 we're fairly happy with. So we ran some block models. So in other words, we introduced all of the variables relating to information flows or social influence in a block. And what you're seeing here are cells which are either green, orange, or blank. So green means there was a significant and positive effect. Orange means there was a significant and negative effect. And blank means there was no significant relationship. So, for example, you can see that domain innovativeness, that is the role that the sort of centrality that a given respondent plays as an innovator in a particular domain, in this case transport. You see that that helps explain adoption of car clubs with quite a strong positive odds ratio. Sorry, I should have said all these coefficients are odds ratios. So, for example, those respondents who are domain innovative are 2.6 times more likely to be adopters than they are non-adopters of car clubs. So you can see the general pattern is these social influence variables are relevant. The exception, or what surprised us, was that interpersonal information sources did not seem to be particularly strong predictors of adoption outside peer-to-peer car sharing and ride sharing. We also looked at the social network structure variables that we had measured in the survey. The ones shown here are a subset of the ones we actually measured. We also measured many other types of homophily, transitivity, and so on. But these ones were the ones which had the most relevant effects for predicting adoption. So you can see here not much of a consistent pattern for social network structure, with the exception of this social media intensity variable, which we used as a crude proxy of how digitally embedded people were in digital networks. So I don't want to go through these in too much detail, but we looked at the effects, also the effects of adopter characteristics and innovation attributes. And you can see from the sort of pretty color pattern that we see quite a lot of significant effects across different innovations, but not particularly consistent ones. With the exception, if you look at the bottom red square that I've just superimposed, you'll see that compatibility and also relative advantage is quite a strong predictor of adoption, in line with what Rogers tells us to expect. So that is innovations which are more compatible with people's existing lives, and innovations with stronger relative advantage more likely to be adopted. But if you look at the top 2 red squares, you see some interesting effects with digital skills, unsurprisingly, given that many of these are digital innovations, and also values. So openness to change is unsurprisingly associated with adoption of these new things which represent change. So the final step is we put all these variables together in an overall integrated model, trying to predict adoption of these innovations. So again, you see it's a fairly sort of mixed picture. You don't see any really strong effects across all innovations, but the bit that I've highlighted in red shows you that for each innovation, there is at least one of our social influence or information related variables, which is a significant predictor. And so this tells us that social influence mechanisms are important. And just finally, if you look down at the bottom, the thing I've circled in red is you see some quite nice R-squared. So these are pretty good models, even though the picture is fairly scattered as to what the robust predictors are. So this is where we're at, and we're looking into this in more depth. So to conclude, we do find that social influence is relevant across in terms of predicting adoption of these innovations, as are the other characteristics that Rogers identified in diffusion of innovation. So broad confirmation of his theoretical assumptions. And to conclude then, we find that social influence is an important part of the story when trying to understand how these innovations get adopted. Now, this may be a very obvious point to the audience at this conference, but in the sort of my research field, which is environmental sciences and looking at climate change, really the usual suspects that we work on are economics and policy and infrastructure and so on. And so we feel that our work helps re-emphasize the importance of social influence in the adoption of these low carbon innovations. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions.